The last talk of our session today is going to be given by Jack Fellows, who will be speaking on geoscience and policy interactions. Jack is the Vice President for, ooh, that's too bright, the Vice President for Corporate Affairs at UCAR and the Director of the UCAR Office of Programs. UCAR is a consortium of 66 universities that grant PhDs in the atmospheric sciences. Jack came to UCAR in 1997 after more of a decade of policy work at the White House and in Congress, and he'll describe part of that in his presentation.
Thank you, Roberta. We've seen three very good presentations on some science issues that are related to policy, and I'm going to take a little bit of a switch here and just give a general overview of the geoscience policy area. What I hope to do here is to answer this question: what are geoscience policies and why should geoscientists care about them? Show a few examples of how our nations have dealt with policy issues and how you can get involved, how you should get involved in policy issues. And like Lou Lanzaretti in his presentation, identify a couple of related sessions that you might want to attend today or during the week. I think I missed a slide. I want to just mention a little bit about my past history, because I guess I consider myself somewhat of a practitioner in the policy area. But I was on a research faculty at Maryland. I was an AGU Congressional Science Fellow in 1983-84, spent a year in the House of Representatives. Because of that, I ended up spending over a decade in the White House, then came to UCAR, and to continue to participate in policy matters through both the AGU and the American Meteorological Society. I wanted to throw up this quote by the late George Burns. This is kind of his comment on politicians and policy making, and he said, "It's too bad all the people who really know how to run the country are busy driving cabs and cutting hair. There may be one or two of you who feel like politicians ought to have these jobs, and maybe some of the folks that have these jobs ought to be in Congress." Let's start with just asking the question, why is policy important? The success and failure of a lot of geoscience activities are now predicated on good public policy, and they fall in the categories of observational systems, telecommunications, computing, data sharing, federal support for R&D, tech transfer, science education, and much, much more. So I think we all in the union have a vested interest to pay attention to public policy, because it affects what we do, and we ought to affect policy ourselves. Geoscience policy is usually focused where situations of human activities and geophysical events collide. So it's floods, climate change, earthquakes, volcanoes, and so on. Policies tend to either focus on minimizing the impact of these events, to try to mitigate or adapt to these events, or to speed the recovery. And the way that we have traditionally as a community have gotten involved is to help set research priorities, to improve the observations, understanding, and predicting. We focus on data availability. We all ought to be focusing on whether or not we have a scientific workforce available now and in the future, and things like tech transfer. How do you take the research we do and move it into the operational arena? Why is policy more important today? There's a lot of reasons. One is population growth. You can see the explosion of world population that's happened in recent history. There's significant increases in per capita consumption of our worldly resources. A lot of movement into areas of vulnerability where natural hazards exist. And there are advancements in science and technology that are both helpful and hurtful to our society, where we'll have better observational platforms, better communications, but we also now have stockpiles of dangerous materials in geologically sensitive areas. We have large dependence on infrastructure like pipelines, communication, road networks, things like that. We've certainly got plenty of places in the United States where people can move into where there are hazards, whether it's hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, volcanoes, landslides. And the result is an awful lot of natural disasters, be it earthquakes or volcanoes or whatever, because society is encroaching on these areas where natural hazards exist. We also have a lot of human-generated situations like pollution, the breakdown of pipelines, pollution. And although a lot of experts say that the number of natural hazards are not increasing, the cost to our society is exponentially increasing. This is just a chart of both the economic and insured losses over the last couple of decades from floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes, and you can see the growth and the impact of our society just in terms of economic losses. And clearly, science, engineering, and technology are an important part of the solutions. We can have better forecasting, better hazard assessments, better construction techniques. We also can do more basic research, so we'll just have fundamental understanding for some of the processes involved in here. But also important is good policy development. This is a quote from Gilbert White, who is a professor emeritus at University of Colorado. He said, if the nation is going to benefit fully from the growing and deepening knowledge of natural hazards, the things that we produce, some effective method must be found to translate that understanding into operative public policy and private procedures. And just a quote from a known criminal here in the United States. His idea of getting involved in politics is just to vote early and vote often. But how can we get involved? Obviously, we can stay involved in policy-relevant research, and a lot of us do that. We look at earthquake hazards, volcanic hazards, tornado hazards, landslide hazards. Or you can also get involved in the policy process. This is a great quote that I saw from Karl Marx's mother that said, instead of just writing about capital, had Karl made a lot of it, it would have been much better. You have to love mothers. But at some point you have to stop talking and you have to start doing. And I'll just give a couple of examples. A lot of people have heard this quote from Mark Twain. Everybody talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. But in the weather and climate area, our nation actually has stopped talking over the last couple of decades and made a significant policy and research framework shift. To give us a quick cartoon of this, for decades we used to say that the accumulation capacity of the atmosphere was infinite, that climate was unchanging, that weather was unpredictable. Today, through a lot of research, a lot of policy shift, our focus is that indeed, the capacity of the atmosphere is actually finite, and it's not just globally, it's locally and regionally that we feel that that's true. The climate can change abruptly. Here's just a picture of Wally Broker and the conveyor belt theories that he's put forward. We also believe that weather is a lot more predictable than we've thought in the past. And what we see in society is newspaper articles like this. In January 2000, the Washington Post had this quote that scientists issued dire prediction of warming. Faster climate shifts portend global calamities this century. So we have our community making statements like this, largely from activities that we're involved in, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the 1995 and the 2000 conclusions from Working Group 1. Not radically different, really. I mean, there are clearly some statements that temperature is going to change, and somehow it's linked to humans. Yet we have we get newspaper articles like I just showed, and that actually ends up being overlaid by a very chaotic international climate negotiation arena. All the way dating back to 1992, when we started this Earth Summit in Rio, where the world actually came together and talked about stabilizing greenhouse gases. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol came into existence that would actually make those targets legally binding. Then our Senate actually passed a resolution that said no climate agreement can be passed by this country unless developing countries are involved and that minimizes the U.S. economy. Then this whole process progresses to November, when the talks basically collapse in The Hague over how you do trading. Then in March, the president said Kyoto Protocol is a failure and that the U.S. administration would not participate in the in the negotiations. Then there was a Bonn summit, and then in November 2001 in Marrakesh, the rest of the world is supposedly supposed to move forward, even without the U.S., to make sure that the Kyoto Protocol goes into force. And then just recently, I think most people know that President Bush announced a new policy framework for climate, and that has to do with U.S. greenhouse gas production will be reduced strictly through voluntary measures, and that those changes will actually be monitored and recorded by industry, and there will be some climate change research. So we've got the press talking about climate change. We've got these negotiations that are sort of oddly overlaid with what the science community is doing through the IPCC process. It's a pretty confusing policy process out there. We, as a community, are continuing to do our process studies. We're looking for a better modeling. We're helping doing assessments through the IPCC. We got these articles happening in the political arena and the international negotiations. So what can we do as a community? We ought to be focusing on a lot of different policy areas in the climate area. Things like what would be the impact on society of sea level rise, impacts on the ecosystem, on economic development. How do you do source and sink trading? How do you do emissions trading? How should we participate in international treaties? And how can we focus research? How can we coordinate research to look both at the long-term and short-term needs, both policy and research? In the era of global change research coordination, this is particularly timely, I think, right now, because I think we, as a community, need to get involved in that. In the late 80s, President Bush's father actually created the U.S. Global Change Research Program. It's roughly a $1.6 billion program to look at research related to global change, but also climate change. There was actually a piece of legislation that was passed in 1990 to institute the U.S. Global Change Research Program and make sure that it didn't change rapidly, that our country actually stayed focused on this research, and there was a mechanism to coordinate and focus that research. Well, just recently, President Bush's son, our current president, has actually introduced a new concept of climate change research initiative without any real new funds or a connection to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So I think our community needs to stay engaged at the policy level to talk about what are the key issues in research, both for our own interests as well as society. How much long-term research should there be? How much short-term research should there be focused on policy issues? And how do we get all the federal agencies who are involved in these activities to coordinate with one another? I think it's a pretty daunting problem. I actually lived through the birth of this program and have watched it evolve over time, and very curious on what's going to happen here. The new Deputy Director of NOAA, Jim Mahoney, is essentially going to be in charge of a lot of this stuff. And I know in part of my job, both here at the AGU and in my own job at UCAR, I'll be visiting him, asking him questions about how does he prevent from throwing away the baby with the bathwater here? We've got a very successful program and a new one that's not well identified, and how do we make sure that these things go in parallel and they're still productive? We shift a little bit from climate change and talk about some other policy issues that the nation has struggled with. This one is nuclear waste disposal, and particularly the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste depository. The politics here are ones that we can all resonate with. We're concerned about what you do with radiation and nuclear waste and the fate of nuclear power and whatever alternatives there are to nuclear power. Lots of policy issues here. Things that have to do with site selection and licensing, health standards, regulations, whether these repositories should be distributed or centralized, whether they should be permanent or retrievable. And the geosciences is really positioned quite well to help in this particular policy area. We can talk an awful lot about the effectiveness of barriers, the risk and consequences of geophysical events to these kind of repositories, and even the impact of the waste on the repositories themselves, either through temperature, humidity, or rock alterations. Another area where we can all get involved in. data is becoming even more of an important area. For us, we think about this as free and open data exchange, for freedom to publish. The politics here are really complicated. You've got things like Napster in the music industry that are looking at these issues of data exchange and rights. You've got other countries' weather services that are starting to restrict data flow and actually charge for data. That'll have a big impact on our science. Lots of policy areas that our community needs to be worried about. The ownership and value of data, the national security aspects of data, whether or not some of our data may be restricted from even our own use. Electronic distribution of data is important through new things like digital libraries. How much freedom are we going to have to be able to allow people to electronically disseminate information? There's actually an act that's going to become law in October of 2000 called the Data Quality Act, which is actually focused on trying to maximize the quality of scientific data in policy making. But because of uncertainty in data, and Lou Lanzarotti actually talked a little bit about this in his talk, about if data isn't, we all deal with data uncertainty, but at some point some policymakers may say, gee, this is too uncertain, so I'm not going to make policy, I'm not going to make regulations, there's too much uncertainty. So while this act is focused on to improve policy making, it actually may be a barrier to policy making. Education is a huge area for us. Obviously, we're all interested in advancing science and what it takes to do that. And the politics are still such that some segments of our youth are testing well below the international averages in some particular areas of science and technology. We have a clear need for our citizens to be in a position to be able to address geoscience issues that are confronting society. And the policy issues are all over the map for us to be able to work on here. One is just the pipeline. We all need to be worried about whether or not we're going to have the kind of pipeline for the future in science and technology, for science literacy of the country in general. Educational standards are important in our particular area. Digital libraries are becoming even more important in our community. And we even have policy issues like creationism versus evolution that are an issue for our community. We actually had a very well-attended session last year on this particular issue of creationism and evolution. Test Ban Treaty. Lots of politics here. It's designed to impede the proliferation of nuclear weapons. There's actually a comprehensive test ban treaty that the U.S. signed in 1996. It's never been ratified, and the verification system's never been implemented, which is made up of 170 seismic stations. The policies here are to avoid restrictions on international scientific data exchanges by them being, in a sense, captured by this and made part of a national security focus so that the geophysical community can't have access to it. Also, maintaining nuclear stockpiles without nuclear tests is a big policy issue. And how do you verify? What kind of network do you really need is a big policy issue in this area. Again, our community is very well positioned to contribute to this policy issue in the sense that we can provide sound science to support the detection and minimize false alarms. We can also comment extensively about storing nuclear stockpiles. And it's a shame that I have to put this up, but I do. I mean, the policy and politics are huge in counterterrorism. Things like water and air quality, nuclear and biological attack, infrastructure, security, we've all been touched by this. The geoscience community has a lot to offer here in terms of observations, a whole suite of observations that we can bring to the table here. Watershed monitoring, plume mitigation, weather forecasting for military applications, space weather, and so on. Lots of other examples that we can get involved in. I won't take the time to do these, but nuclear energy, ocean and coastal zone, earthquakes, clean air and water. There's no end to the level of contribution that our community can make into the policy arena. Let me talk just a little bit about how you can get involved. There's lots of avenues. You can take a job. This was my experience. I did this AGU Congressional Science Fellowship. I then took a job in the White House for a decade, did some policy research. But something that you can do right now, this week, you can get involved in AGU and other professional society policy activities. And there's lots of opportunities. I'll just give you some examples of the things that I've done in terms of outreach. I've gotten together with the American Meteorological Society and Pete Folger here at the AGU, and we just make visits to the Hill, and we talk about our professional society and say, we're here, between the three organizations, 65,000 people, and we can bring a lot of expertise to policy arenas. Pete and I and Bill Hook of the AMS met with John Marburger about the first week he was in office to tell him about the AGU, UCAR, and AMS and how we can help him. We also spend a lot of time working on testimonies and doing Hill briefings. UCAR did one on, and UCAR and the American Meteorological Society did Hill briefings on hurricanes and energy policy, where we actually brought experts from our community and did presentations on the Hill in areas that are relevant to legislation. So we could build a relationship with people on the Hill. We could also convey some useful information that might be helpful for legislation and basically present the view of the science community. We're also working very closely with a new caucus that's been formed, the Natural Hazard Caucus, to help bring our community's voice into that process of looking at natural hazards around the country. Some other visits we do is when the Bonn meeting was coming up in Germany for climate change negotiations, a group of us actually went to the Hill and laid out the whole IPCC process for a brand new set of staffers who had not had to deal with international climate negotiations before. You probably can't read it, but in the center there is a document that the atmospheric science community put out called National Security and the Essential Role of the Atmospheric Sciences. That was a very brief document that we distributed to the Hill to essentially tell the Hill that we're in a position to help you in the time of this new era of terrorism. It wasn't asking for anything. It was saying, you've invested 40 years worth of funds into our area, and you've positioned us to be able to help to help in the terrorism, anti-terrorism activities. We also produce transition documents for the new administration, one in natural hazards and one in weather. These transitional documents would ask questions like, why should natural hazard reduction become a national priority, and give some information why that is. $2 trillion of our economy is affected by weather and climate. We suffer from 16 billions of damages each year, but we don't put very much money in this area. And then some examples on the right of if we had better information, what kind of money would we save? So we gave statistics on if there was better hurricane landfall prediction, how much money would you save? What would utilities save? What would airlines save? Things like that. So just really raising people's consciousness of what that could be done in the natural hazard areas and what an organization like the AGU, the AMS, UCAR, and others can bring to the table here. The other thing you can do is become a leader in this area. AGU offers us all an opportunity to become Congressional Science Fellows. Sorry, Pete, this is actually the AMS Congressional Science Fellow. I didn't have a picture of Karen Whalen, our current AGU Congressional Science Fellow. But here she is on a congressional delegation trip to the Wall of China. So she's not only had a great experience on the Hill, but really seen a lot of the world and examined a lot of interesting science and policy issues. You can also get involved in a lot of policy symposiums. The American Meteorological Society just started a summer symposium to look at policy issues. And this is last year's group of AMS policy symposium attendees. That's actually next week, just following the AGU meeting. But the AGU does similar kind of policy-oriented symposiums. Lots of great opportunities to get involved here at AGU. The AGU has policy positions on a broad range of topics, and you can see them on the right. They have to do with math and science education, creationism, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, climate change, space station, geophysicals, research, the importance of archiving data. I mean, it's basically all the topics that I covered. I mean, the AGU actually has a position developed by the community on these various areas. You can get involved in this process as well. And some of the ways are to get involved in the AGU Committee on Public Affairs, the AGU Committee on Education and Human Resources, which Roberta chairs. Both of these are very active committees in the AGU. You can also participate in the Congressional Visits Day that the AGU sponsors every year, Coalition for National Science Foundation, and you should sign up for the AGU Science and Legislative Alerts that Pete Folger here at AGU puts out, so you can be aware of some of the policy things that are coming to the forefront, pieces of legislation that may be passed, or ways that you can get involved in even these congressional visit days. What they're called ASLAs, these alerts allow you to know what's coming up in Washington that you can participate from a policy perspective. But why should we care? Our society has actually been supported by the federal government for over 100 years to do research. So I think almost all of us have a responsibility to help society to deal with the things that are related to natural and human-related hazards. And I think that Winston Churchill actually summed it up the best way. We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. And I think it's important for us to realize that we really have a responsibility here to give back to our community. There are a lot of sessions this week that will touch on the policy area. I actually, they're in this slide, but I put them on some pieces of paper on a chair backed by the slide projector in case anyone's interested. But there are ones on climate, on geophysics and terrorism, fires, integrating climate research and application assessments, sustainability of fresh water, carbon management and technologies, atmospheric chemistry, math and science partnerships, geophysics in the 20th century, impacts on urban land use change and hydrology, remote sensing, and science, politics, and watershed management. There are a lot of sessions this week that you can participate in that will present great science, but will also touch on these areas of policies. And in your particular discipline, there may be one that you might want to get involved in, even beyond one of these sessions. Now, in case you're feeling a little uneasy with politics or policy, or you feel like maybe you're not smart enough to participate in this process, there was a great quote by Napoleon Bonaparte that said, "In politics, stupidity is not a handicap." So we can all be involved in this process, and it's really incumbent upon us to bring our knowledge to the policy process. So I hope that you all will try to attend one of these policy sessions today and make a point of exploring how you might be involved in a lot of the various AGU activities that are offered to you to be able to be involved in policy, whether it's membership on one of these committees, the public affairs, or the education committee, or just signing up for these ASLAs, so you'll know what's going on and you'll be able to participate at the right time in history. So I'm going to stop there. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Well, I'm not sure there's going to be one answer to that. I think one thing is to try to stick to the science when you're engaging with the media, and also just to make yourself available and make relationships with the media. This is a tough issue because I've actually, when I was in the White House, I periodically ended up being quoted, and it was never what I said. It was really amazing. But over that period, they got better because I formed relationships with people in the media, and they took the time to probe you a little bit, and I did the same to them. So, like I said, I don't think there's an answer to this, but I think it's probably, get engaged, stick to the science. It's probably the answer. Luke.
Well, this is my pet hobby work, but there's also a famous quote from late O'Neill, who said that all politics is local. He's heard this many times. And another way folks could and should get involved is through their local community and statewide activities as well. You point out that geoscientists have had federal or sometimes support for 100 years, but many of our members, if not the majority of our members, are affiliated with state-supported institutions and universities, in particular colleges. And at the state and local level is where a lot of very important policy decisions are made. Well, we heard this a little bit in Mary Barron's talk in 2307 in Pennsylvania. And one can make a big impact on local issues that involve geoscience. The AGU is sponsoring sessions on coastal approaches that are very locally related to Massachusetts and East Coast. And so one can think about getting involved locally on local advisory committees and activities, school boards, and public office, and making contact with state legislators as well.
That's a good point. Largely through your leadership, the AGU's Committee on Public Affairs has actually made this a focal point. It's a tough one because it's pretty distributed on what
very diffused, not as sexy oftentimes as the federal, global, international scene, but can make a significant impact on one local community and on the taxpayers who support one, because they see what geoscientists can bring to bear in the local community. We've got to support that federal level.
Yes. I'm from the American Institute, and I just wanted to also add that we have a Professional Science Fellowship and the State Department Science Fellowship, and those are open to all members of AGU also. And if you need information about that, it's on our website. But those are also open to all the members of Carmen Society.
Thank you. It's probably worth describing this fellowship just really briefly. It's a very interesting year you spend. When I was a fellow in 83, 84, there were 35 other fellows. So you ended up having kind of a class of fellows. You all went to the Hill. You got the same training that a new member of Congress got when he came to Congress over a 2-week period. Then you were a free agent. You were basically paid off of outside of Congress, and you could go and advertise yourself any place in Congress and get any job you wanted. And I ended up with a representative in the House. His name was George Brown. He's now deceased, but I worked in his personal office, but also worked as his liaison to the House Space Science Committee on space issues, and ended up writing 3 pieces of legislation. And I would have never predicted that that was going to happen. And over the course of the year, you stay engaged in this class of fellows and have a really deep, rich experience through interactions with your class of fellows as well as your professional activities that you do on the Hill. So it tends to be focused a little bit on the recent PhD, but in my class it was pretty mixed. We had some people in their 60s and one man in his 70s who was a Congressional Science Fellow. So I would highly recommend that to anyone here, or if you want to recommend it to anyone that you know. It's just an incredible experience to spend a year in Congress and see how that whole process works. Pete.
Just to follow up, we're going to be holding a luncheon briefing by the fellows on Thursday at noon over at the Renaissance Mall in the North, where our current AGU fellow, and we'll be joined by another professional fellow, as well as 2 mass media fellows. AGU sponsors a 3-month mass media fellowship as well. It's a chance for you, if you'd like to come over and hear about their experience and why they got involved with the country. On Thursday over
Any other questions?
My name is Bruce Mulligan. I'm a legislative fellow in the Office of Congressman Kurt Rowland. I've been there for the last 3.5 years. I'm detailed in the Department of the Interior. My job is to run the House Socialist Caucus. 2 years ago, we sponsored a Capital Hill Ocean Policy Development Day, and Pete, AGU, as well as the AAAS, were our hosts and helped us take care of some of the logistics. But during that meeting, one of the participants, we had 350 people participate in our Ocean Policy Development Day. I asked the congressman I work for, Kurt Walden from Pennsylvania, why is Congress doing so little about the oceans? And he looked at the group in the room and asked, how many of you know who the legislative assistant is in your member's office? Every member of Congress has at least one person who focuses on the oceans or environment. And he asked, in your school district, how many of you know who that legislative assistant is? Out of the 300 plus people, probably a dozen hands go up. And then he said, how many of you know that each of your senators has at least one individual in their office, both in their district office and in their Washington office, that's involved in ocean-related issues? How many of you know who those are? You can see your hands go up. He said, until you actually make contact with those people, tell them why the oceans are important, and help them develop an agenda, you're not talking about an agenda. He's being snowed by visits by all of the paid lobbyists and everybody else who has particular issues they want you to be familiar with. Plus, he has his own particular issues. In my case, this is next. So, unless you make that initial and follow-on steps to develop contact with the people who are responding to your wishes and your needs, oceans, and you can substitute education or geoscience or any term you want, there's going to be lower level or missing from that plate. And so it's up to all of us as responsible voters to not only go out there as professional scientists, but to make that contact and tell Congress why the importance of oceans is there or geoscience issues that you think is up.
Other questions? You say, we're quite on the work of local work, and you said that that's the focus of focus. Can you say a little bit about what you're doing now?
Well, Kathy, it'd probably be fair if Pete did this, because it's there was a big push, I guess, a year or two ago, I guess, to try to have local issues highlighted at the meetings. And there is, I think, part of your... You should really answer this, because I'm kind of making this up.
What's going on there? I think we could say 2 or 3 issues we need to deal with. And what we try to do in headquarters is just alert members, AG members in this community what's going on. The main issues that were addressed by creation of in our science class, in this case, Japanese AG science legislative work that we're able to send those to our members in the district or state. There's concern that members are giving information. People are basically getting letters, fax, or calls their school board members or on the week. In our effective, there were a couple of cases where state geological survey agencies that North Carolina and other states did the same thing. Let them know what was going on, even for action as they solve that. But it's really the crux of the problem when you develop information gathering. What issues are concerned. I can see that people might have concerns about, say, zoning ordinances or development plans that may be defined based on what we know about hydrology or surface processing. Those kind of things are really important to let our members know. Why not they can weigh in? It's a good idea or bad idea based on what I know. But, it's almost like a plea you all to let us know, let your members know, let the public affairs office know what is important to you what's going on this year. Get the word out for our also, as you mentioned, we do have sections that COPA puts on that have had a local focus. The coastal issue was one that we won a couple of years ago on the Woburn toxic case in Massachusetts, and it's very interesting. But a little more suggests topics or sections that performance meeting. That's another way of getting to a couple of your colleagues aware of the local implications of what they're doing in the science and policy. A bit more convincing.
Any other questions? Before I let you go, let me just point out we have a new thing that we're bringing online here at AGU out of the CEHR, that some of which touch on policy. These are luncheon discussion groups over in the Education and Student Lounge. That's over in the Exhibit Hall D area near the Career Center. The thought there is that if you're interested on these topics, you could come and join other colleagues and we'll have some discussion around these topics. Today we'll be talking about Earth and Space Science Education Revolution. Tomorrow, NSF's Criterion 2 and developments on that front. Math and science partnerships on Thursday, and then the workforce issue, diversity in the Earth and Space Sciences, on Friday. I want to thank you all for attending and for the wonderful talks that we've had, and hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting. Thanks very much.